So I just finished Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and I'm a big fan. This is the second novel by Charles Dickens, who was one of the most renowned Victorian people of the age. He not only was a novelist, he also was a big proponent of child's rights and of labor laws. And that is where this book as social commentary really comes into it, because it's a lot about what it feels like to be a child on the streets of London and on the streets of English towns in general. And I really liked this. I was surprised because I previously read 3 of his other books and had been all right with, like, I didn't love them, I didn't hate them, I just felt very middle of the road of them. And David Copperfield I've re-examined a little bit because I definitely do have some love for it, but I definitely have a harder time with first-person narration, and that book is extenuously long. Oliver Twist is much more concise at 600 pages. You know, when that's a compliment, there's something to be worrying. But Oliver is not the most well-drawn character. He is a member of perfection in many ways, which keeps him from being fully fleshed because he is pretty darn perfect. He doesn't have a flaw, he cries a lot, and he's quite emotional, but even with no moral training or anything like that, he still endeavors to do right in every situation. And could it be being more flawed? Yeah, probably. However, I did find the story around him so interesting that I didn't actually care that he was not the most pulsating main character, because I really loved the world. They felt really alive in ways that I hadn't before, and I felt it very interesting as well. We begin kind of in a small town where he's a pauper and his mother dies upon his birth, and he is given to this woman, Mrs. Mann, who is not great. And then, you know, at age 9 he goes from the workhouse. They don't like him, they don't feed him, they make him go to several not very savory apprenticeships where he is not treated right and where he is not fed. And eventually he runs away and gets picked up by a band of thieves. And this is when things get interesting, because he does not want to be a criminal, which I definitely thought he was going to be more criminal and mischievous, which he's not really. He's like an innocent little angel soul. Instead, he is, you know, swayed on the many whims of people's fashions in which he would not rather. He is caring about his soul. The antagonists here are when some of the problematic aspects of the books come in, because Fagin, who is barely called Fagin in the section, he is almost exclusively called the Jew. In the first 38 chapters, he's called the Jew 258 times versus only 48 times of his name or old man. Those statistics are from Wikipedia, but I'm not sourcing them myself. But you can tell, at one point I was like, is this the same character? Because he is not named. I don't even know when he is named at the beginning, and it opens with him literally touching golden treasures and then threatening Oliver if he saw the treasures, and him being like, I'm a pauper, I have no money, I'm a miser. And obviously this is a really problematic representation of a Jewish character, and one character that isn't just by happenstance Jewish. He is called the Jew more than his name, which means this is the most important thing about him, even to his own identity. Because of that representation that's so problematic and that's so greasy and untruthful and miserable and manipulative, it really is really terrible, to the extent in which critics actually came across Charles Dickens and were like, hey, stop this. And as the chapters go on, he does stop referring to him as the Jew as much and refers to him as Fagin more often, and also definitely decreases some of his more problematic traits. On the other hand, he would be like, well, Jewish people just kind of tend to be criminals. To pull from my grade 9 class where we talked about the roots of anti-Semitic thoughts, a lot of this came back to that fact that Christians were not able to charge interest to one another. So often that fell out to people who were not Christians, i.e. a lot of Jewish people took up on the opportunity of being moneylenders and being bankers, providing a really necessary trait for societies to run, because a lot of people didn't want to give out money without interest, but they also didn't want to be cheated and all of those things. So Jewish people took on this role and yet were penalized for it because they were seen as being involved with money and being involved with banks, despite the fact that many Jewish people were very, very poor and very discriminated against. And even if there was wealth, they were often not accepted into the communities as a whole. And this represents a really problematic thing that still carries on today. And less than 100 years after this book was published in 1938, we'd have the Holocaust that would kill 6 million Jews, which is 2/3% of the population of Jewish people. And many people in the United States and Canada, around the world, were not really against the anti-Semiticness in the Nazi Party. And just like all of this is like full circle, and like there was tons of Jewish people that got slaughtered because Canada, the United States, did not actually accept refugees, neither did England, of Jewish people, and many people died for that reason. Like the ways in which like a character like Fagin is represented in 1838 has ripples throughout history that is like haunting and problematic and all of these things. And Charles Dickens, as he went on, would actually go back and renounce some of these things. He would later sell his house to a Jewish banker and they would become friends. And by 1860, he would have rubbed 180 references to the Jew from the book, replacing it with his name. And by the end of his life, he would produce editions that scrubbed a lot of the really nefarious and stereotypical presentations of Fagin from the thing, letting him be Jewish, but not having so much of the representation that characterized him in a really unflattering and universal representation of what a Jewish man is. I find this part of the conversation really essential to talk about alongside my love of Oliver Twist, because in many parts of it, like, it made me physically uncomfortable because of the ways that it's rooted in history and the ways in which we know how this is being propelled forward to something that would be catastrophic for an entire group of people, and how it still plays out in anti-Semitic thoughts today. So like, it is such a really important thing to talk about, that this timeless, one of his most famous tales, features all of these things. That's something that Charles Dickens himself would regret by the end of his life. I'm not a master of the biography of Charles Dickens, but I am encouraged by the fact that he was willing to change, that he was willing to adapt, and he was willing to admit failure. Katie from Books and Things talks about this in her wrap-up for the book, where she talks about how he also would portray more Jewish characters in positive lights at the end of his life. And I have always loved listening to the way in which Katie from Books and Things talks about it. It's her favorite author of all time, and she, I believe, wrote her thesis on this. So she's very educated about Dickens in ways that, like, I can only dream to imagine. But I was really happy that this was the first Dickens books that I actually fell fully in love with. And I think part of it was the overarching narrative. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheekness going on. There's a lot of like, we're gonna return to this town to talk about this event that might not seem like it actually matters of anything. However, it will matter, and like, you don't have to think about it until it does. And throughout this, we do have like lots of scenes from Fagin and the gang, and then we also have this narration of Mr. Bamble and, you know, the story of him and his many affairs and endeavors in this, as well as other characters that are going around and thinking about things but not sure how they're thinking about things and what they're up to. And Oliver as a character will have many things turning around in circles of him. And yeah, it is definitely not a perfect novel. Like, I think, you know, some of the female characters definitely are not fully fleshed or human-like, and so many of the characters are based on some stereotype or are based on more rougher drafts in themselves. Like, I can't necessarily imagine what they would be doing outside of life. Although Mr. Brownlow and his friend, I love that. Like, you know, men in their 60s to 80s, wherever they are, just like disagreeing and like having to disagree. Like, there's the humor in there, and like the jokes of how people interact is very evident. Even if I guess I don't know what they would do as individual characters, I can see what they would do in social situations, and that's hilarious to me. I just had a good time, and I felt that it was very full of life. And yeah, I'm really excited to read more Dickens. I kind of did my Victorian long-term TBR because I finished David Copperfield, and I talked about how I liked that novel, but I definitely felt exhausted at the thought of starting another one. I definitely felt much more anticipatory about reading more Dickens after this, and I was very tempted to pick up another one, but then I was like, am I just doing this and it's gonna like merge into mine? And it is such a long book, and I don't want to abandon my whole TBR, but I kind of wanted to abandon my whole TBR, and that is a great sign. So let me know if you've read Oliver Twist. What do you think about the representation of the workhouses, of Fagin as a character, and the ways in which that courses throughout history, and just the characters of a whole? I would love to know what you would recommend going to Dickens first. I have so far read David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities, and A Christmas Carol. So I would love to hear where I should go next. Other books that are in the Victorian era or have that kind of full of life characterization that I love, and tongue-in-cheek narration. I love those books so much, and yeah, I just love talking about books that I love so much.